Section 30 of the Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sean Stipsky. Address of Jefferson Davis at Faneuil Hall, Boston, October 12, 1858. Countrymen, brethren, Democrats, most happy am I to meet you, and to have received here renewed assurance of that which I have so long believed, that the pulsation of the democratic heart is the same in every parallel of latitude, on every meridian of longitude, throughout the United States. It required not this to confirm me in a belief I have so long and so happily enjoyed. Your own great statesman, the Honorable Caleb Cushing, who has introduced me to this assembly, has been too long associated with me, too nearly connected. We have labored too many hours until one day ran into another in the cause of our country, for me to fail to understand that a Massachusetts Democrat has a heart as wide as the Union, and that its pulsations always beat for the liberty and happiness of his country. Neither could I be unaware that such was the sentiment of the democracy of New England. For it was my fortune lately to serve under a president drawn from the neighboring state of New Hampshire, and I know that he spoke the language of his heart, for I learned it in 4 years of intimate relations with him, when he said he knew no North, no South, no East, no West, but sacred maintenance of the common bond and true devotion to the common brotherhood. Never, sir, in the past history of our country, never, I add, in its future destiny, however bright it may be, did or will a man of higher and purer patriotism, a man more devoted to the common weal of his country, hold the helm of our great ship of state than Franklin Pierce. I have heard the resolutions read and approved by this meeting. I have heard the address of your candidate for governor, and these, added to the address of my old and intimate friend, General Cushing, bear to me fresh testimony, which I shall be happy to carry away with me, that the democracy, in the language of your own glorious Webster, still lives not as his great spirit did, when it hung twixt life and death, like a star upon the horizon's verge, but lives like the germ that is shooting upward, like the sapling that is growing to a mighty tree, and I trust it may redeem Massachusetts to her glorious place in the Union, when she led the van of the defenders of state rights. When I see Faneuil Hall thus thronged, it reminds me of another meeting, when it was found too small to contain the assembly that met here, on the call of the people to know what should be done in relation to the tea tax, and when, Faneuil Hall being too small, they went to the Old South Church, which still stands a monument of your early day. I hope the time will soon come when many Democratic meetings in Boston will be too large for Faneuil Hall. I am welcome to this hall, so venerable for all the associations of our early history, to this hall of which you are so justly proud, and the memories of which are part of the inheritance of every American citizen. And I felt as I looked upon it, and remembered how many voices of patriotic fervor have filled it, how here the first movement originated from which the Revolution sprang, how here began the system of town meetings and free discussion, that though my theme was more humble than theirs, as befitted my humbler powers, I had enough to warn me that I was assuming much to speak in this sacred chamber. But when I heard your distinguished orator say that words uttered here could never die, that they lived and became a part of the circumambient air, I feel a hesitation which increases upon me with the remembrance of his expressions. But if those voices which breathed the first impulse into the colonies, now the United States, to proclaim independence, and to unite for resistance against the power of the mother country, if those voices live here still, how must they fare who come here to preach treason to the Constitution and to assail the union of these states? It would seem that their criminal hearts would fear that those voices, so long slumbering, would break silence, that those forms which hang upon these walls behind me might come forth, and that the sabers so long sheathed would leap from their scabbards to drive from this sacred temple those who desecrate it, as did the money changers who sold doves in the temple of the living God. Here you have to remind you and to remind all who enter this hall the portraits of those men who are dear to every lover of liberty, and part and parcel of the memory of every American citizen. And highest among them all, I see you have placed Samuel Adams and John Hancock. You have placed them the highest, and properly, for they were two, the only two, excepted from the proclamation of mercy, when Governor Gage issued his anathema against them and against their fellow patriots. These men, thus excepted from the saving grace of the crown, now occupy the highest places in Faneuil Hall, and thus seem to be the highest in the reverence of the people of Boston. This is one of the instances in which we find tradition so much more reliable than history, for tradition has borne the name of Samuel Adams to the remotest of the colonies, and the new states formed out of what was territory of the old colonies, and there it is a name as sacred among us as it is among you. We all remember how early we saw the necessity of community independence, how through the dim mists of the future and in advance of his day he looked forward to the proclamation of the independence of Massachusetts, how he steadily strove through good report and evil report, with a great, unwavering heart, whether in the midst of his fellow citizens, cheered by their voices, or communing with his own heart. When driven from his home, his eyes were still fixed upon his first, last hope, the community independence of Massachusetts. Always a commanding figure, we see him at a later period, the leader in the correspondence which waked the feelings of the other colonies to united fraternal association, the people of Massachusetts with the people of the other colonies. There we see his letters acknowledging the receipt of rice of South Carolina and the money of New York and Pennsylvania. All these poured in to relieve Boston of the sufferings inflicted upon her when the port was closed by the despotism of the British Crown. We see the beginning of that which ensured the cooperation of the colonies throughout the desperate struggle of the Revolution. And we there see that which, if the present generation be true to the memory of their sires, to the memory of the noble men from whom they descended, will perpetuate for them that spirit of fraternity in which the Union began. But it is not here alone, nor in reminiscences connected with the objects which present themselves within this hall, that the people of Boston have much to excite their patriotism, and carry them back to the great principles of the Revolutionary struggle. Where will you go and not meet some monument to inspire such sentiments? Go to Lexington and Concord, where 60 brave countrymen came with their fowling pieces to oppose 600 veterans, where they forced those veterans back, pursuing them on the road, fighting them from every barn and bush and stock and stone, till they drove them retreating to the ships from which they went forth. And there stand those monuments of your early patriotism, Breed's and Bunker's Hill, whose soil drank the martyr blood of men who lived for their country and died for mankind. Can it be that any of you should tread that soil and forget the great purposes for which those men died? While, on the other side, rise the heights of Dorchester, where once stood the encampment of the Virginian, the man who came here and did not ask, "Is this a town of Virginia?" but, "Is this a town of my brethren?" The steady courage and cautious wisdom of Washington availed to drive the British troops out from the city which they had so confidently held. Here, too, you find where once the old Liberty Tree, connected with so many of your memories, grew. You ask your legend and learn that it was cut down for firewood by British soldiers as some of your meeting houses were destroyed. They burned the old tree, and it warmed the soldiers long enough to leave town, and had they burned it a little longer, its light would have shown Washington and his followers where the enemies were. But they are gone, and never again shall a hostile foot set its imprint upon your soil. Your harbor is being fortified to prevent an unexpected attack on your city by a hostile fleet. But woe to the enemy whose fleet shall bear him to your shores to set his footprint upon your soil. He goes to a prison or to a grave. American fortifications are not built from any fear of invasion. They are intended to guard points where marine attacks can be made, and for the rest, the hearts of Americans are our ramparts. But, my friends, it is not merely in these associations, so connected with the honorable pride of Massachusetts, that one who visits Boston finds much for gratification, hope, and instruction. If I were selecting a place where the advocate of strict construction, the extreme expounder of democratic state rights doctrine should go for his text, I would send him into the collections of your historical associations. Instead of going to Boston as a place where only consolidation would be found, he would find written in letters of living light that sacred creed of state rights which has been miscalled the ultra opinions of the South. He could find among your early records that this Faneuil Hall, the property of the town at the time when Massachusetts was under a colonial government, administered by a man appointed by the British Crown, guarded by British soldiers, was refused to a British governor in which to hold a British festival, because he was going to bring with him the agents for collecting, and naval officers sent here to enforce an oppressive tax upon your commonwealth. Such was the proud spirit of independence manifested even in your colonial history. Such is the great foundation stone on which may be erected an eternal monument of state rights. And so, in an early period of our country, you find Massachusetts leading the movements, prominent of all the states, in the assertion of that doctrine which has been recently so much belied. Having achieved your independence, having passed through the Confederation, you assented to the formation of our present constitutional union. You did not surrender your sovereignty. Your fathers had sacrificed too much to claim as a reward of their toil, merely that they should have a change of masters, and a change of masters it would have been had Massachusetts surrendered her state sovereignty to the central government, and consented that that central government should have the power to coerce a state. But if this power does not exist, if this sovereignty has not been surrendered, then who can deny the words of soberness and truth spoken by your candidate this evening, when he has pleaded to you the cause of state independence, and the right of every community to be judge of its own domestic affairs? This is all we have ever asked, we of the South, I mean, for I stand before you as one of those who have always been called the ultra men of the South, and I speak, therefore, for that class, and I tell you that your candidate for governor has uttered tonight everything which we have claimed as a principle for our protection. And I have found the same condition of things in the neighboring state of Maine. I have found that the Democrats there asserted the same broad constitutional principle for which we have been contending, by which we are willing to live, for which we are willing to die. In this state of the case, my friends, why is the country agitated? The old controversies have passed away, or they have subsided, and have been covered up by one dark pall of somber hue, which increases with every passing year. Why is it, then, I say, that you are thus agitated in relation to the domestic affairs of other communities? Why is it that the peace of the country is disturbed in order that one people may judge of what another people may do? Is there any political power to authorize such interference? If so, where is it? You did not surrender your sovereignty. You gave to the federal government certain functions. It was your agent, created for specified purposes. It can do nothing save that which you have given it power to perform. Where is the grant? Has it a right to determine what shall be property? Surely not. That belongs to every community to decide for itself. You judge in your case. Every other state must judge in its case. The federal government has no power to destroy property. Do you pay taxes, then, to an agent that he may destroy your property? Do you support him for that purpose? It is an absurdity on the face of it. To ask the question is to answer it. The government is instituted to protect, not destroy, property. And, in abundance of caution, your fathers provided that the federal government should not take private property for its own use, unless by making due compensation therefor. It is prohibited from attempting to destroy property. One of its great purposes was protection to the states. Whenever that power is made a source of danger, we destroy the purpose for which the government was formed. Why, then, have you agitators? With pharisaical pretension it is sometimes said it is a moral obligation to agitate, and I suppose they are going through a sort of vicarious repentance for other men's sins. With all due allowance for their zeal, we ask, how do they decide that it is a sin? By what standard do they measure it? Not the Constitution. The Constitution recognizes the property in slaves in many forms, and imposes obligations in connection with that recognition. Not the Bible, that justifies it. Not the good of society, for if they go where it exists, they find that society recognizes it as good. What, then, is their standard? The good of mankind? Is that seen in the diminished resources of the country? Is that seen in the diminished comfort of the world? Or is not the reverse exhibited? Is there in the cause of Christianity a motive for the prohibition of the system which is the only agency through which Christianity has reached that inferior race, the only means by which they have been civilized and elevated? Or is their piety manifested in denunciation of their brethren, who are deterred from answering their denunciation only by the contempt which they feel for a mere brawler, who intends to end his brawling only in empty words? What, my friends, must be the consequences? Good or evil? They have been evil, and evil they must be only to the end. Not one particle of good has been done to any man of any color by this agitation. It has been insidiously working the purpose of sedition for the destruction of that union on which our hopes of future greatness depend. On the one side, then, you see agitation tending slowly and steadily to that separation of states, which, if you have any hope connected with the liberty of mankind, if you have any national pride connected with making your country the greatest on the face of the earth, if you have any sacred regard for the obligations which the deeds and the blood of your fathers entailed upon you, that hope should prompt you to reject anything that would tend to destroy the result of that experiment which they left it to you to conclude and perpetuate. On the other hand, if each community, in accordance with the principles of our government, should regard its domestic interests as a part of the common whole, and struggle for the benefit of all, this would steadily lead us to fraternity, to unity, to cooperation, to the increase of our happiness and the extension of the benefits of our useful example over mankind. The flag of the Union, whose stars have already more than doubled their original number, with its ample folds may wave the recognized flag of every state, or the recognized protector of every state, upon the continent of America. In connection with the view which I have presented of the early idea of community independence, I will add the very striking fact that one of the colonies, about the time they had resolved to unite for the purpose of achieving their independence, addressed the Colonial Congress to know in what condition it would be in the interval between its separation from the government of Great Britain and the establishment of a government on this continent. The answer of the Colonial Congress was exactly what might have been expected, exactly what state rights democracy would answer today to such an inquiry, that they had nothing to do with it. If such sentiment had continued, if it had governed in every state, if representatives had been chosen upon it, then your halls of federal legislation would not have been disturbed about the question of the domestic institutions of the different states. The peace of the country would not be hazarded by the arraignment of the family relations of people over whom the government has no control. If in harmony working together, with co-intelligence for the conservation of the interests of the country, if protection to the states and the other great ends for which the government was established had been the aim and united effort of all, what effects would not have been produced? As our government increases in expansion, it would increase in its beneficent effect upon the people. We should, as we grow in power and prosperity, also grow in fraternity, and it would be no longer a wonder to see a man coming from a Southern state to address a Democratic audience in Boston. But I have referred to the fact that Massachusetts stood preeminently forward among those who asserted community independence, and this reminds me of another incident. President Washington visited Boston when John Hancock was governor, and Hancock refused to call upon the President because he contended that any man who came within the limits of Massachusetts must yield rank and precedence to the governor of the state. He eventually only surrendered the point on account of his personal regard and respect for the character of George Washington. I honor him for this, and value it as one of the early testimonies in favor of state rights. I wish all our governors had the same regard for the dignity of the state as had the great and glorious John Hancock. In the beginning, the founders of this government were true democratic state rights men. Democracy was state rights, and state rights was democracy, and it is so today. Your resolutions breathe it. The Declaration of Independence embodied the sentiments which had lived in the hearts of the country for many years before its formal assertion. Our fathers asserted the great principle, the right of the people to choose their own government, and that government rested upon the consent of the governed. In every form of expression it uttered the same idea, community independence and the dependence of the Union upon the communities of which it consisted. It was an American declaration of the unalienable right of man. It was a general truth, and I wish it were accepted by all men. But I have said that this state sovereignty, this community independence, has never been surrendered, and that there is no power in the federal government to coerce a state. Will anyone ask me then how a state is to be held to the fulfillment of its obligations? My answer is, by its honor. The obligation is the more sacred to observe every feature of the compact, because there is no power to enforce it. The great error of the Confederation was that it attempted to act upon the states. It was found impracticable, and our present form of government was adopted, which acts upon individuals, and is not designed to act upon states. The question of state coercion was raised in the convention which framed the Constitution, and, after discussion, the proposition to give power to the general government to enforce against any state obedience to the laws was rejected. It is upon the ground that a state cannot be coerced that observance of the compact is a sacred obligation. It was upon this principle that our fathers depended for the perpetuity of a fraternal union, and for the security of the rights that the Constitution was designed to preserve. The Fugitive Slave Compact in the Constitution of the United States implied that the states should fulfill it voluntarily. They expected the states to legislate so as to secure the rendition of fugitives, and in 1778 it was a matter of complaint that the Spanish colony of Florida did not restore fugitive Negroes from the United States who escaped into that colony, and a committee composed of Hamilton of New York, Sedgwick of Massachusetts, and Mason of Virginia reported resolutions in Congress instructing the Secretary of Foreign Affairs to address the Charge d'Affaires at Madrid to apply to His Majesty of Spain to issue orders to his governor to compel them to secure the rendition of fugitive Negroes. This was the sentiment of the committee, and they added also that the states would return any slaves from Florida who might escape into their limits. When the constitutional obligation was imposed, who could have doubted that every state, faithful to its obligations, would comply with the requirements of the Constitution and waive all questions as to whether the institution should or should not exist in another community over which they had no control? Congress was at last forced to legislate on the subject, and they have continued up to a recent period to legislate, and this has been one of the causes by which you have been disturbed. You have been called upon to make war against a law which need never to have been enacted if each state had done the duty which she was called upon by the Constitution to perform. Gentlemen, this presents one phase of agitation, Negro agitation. There is another and graver question. It is in relation to the prohibition by Congress of the introduction of slave property into the territories. What power does Congress possess in this connection? Has it the right to say what shall be property anywhere? If it has, from what clause of the Constitution does it derive that power? Have other states the power to prescribe the condition upon which a citizen of another state shall enter upon and enjoy territory, common property of all? Clearly not. Shall the inhabitants who first go into the territory deprive any citizen of the United States of those rights which belong to him as an equal owner of the soil? Certainly not. Sovereign jurisdiction can only pass to these inhabitants when the states, the owners of that territory, shall recognize their right to become an equal member of the Union. Until then, the Constitution and the laws of the Union must be the rule governing within the limits of a territory. The Constitution recognizes all property and gives equal privileges to every citizen of the states, and it would be a violation of its fundamental principles to attempt any discrimination. There is nothing of truth or justice with which to sustain this agitation, or a ground for it, unless it be that it is a very good bridge over which to pass into office, a little stock of trade in politics built up to aid men who are missionaries staying at home, reformers of things which they do not go to learn, preachers without a congregation, overseers without laborers and without wages, war horses who snuff the battle afar off and cry, "Aha! Aha! I am afar off!" Thus it is that the peace of the Union is disturbed. Thus it is that brother is arrayed against brother. Thus it is that the people come to consider not how they can promote each other's interests, but how they may successfully war upon them. And among the things most odious to my mind is to find a man who enters upon a public office under the sanction of the Constitution, and taking an oath to support the Constitution, the compact between the states binding each for the common defense and general welfare of the other, and retaining to himself a mental reservation that he will war upon the institutions and the property of any of the states of the Union. It is a crime too low to characterize as it deserves before this assembly. It is one which would disgrace a gentleman, one which a man with self-respect would never commit. To swear that he will support the Constitution, to take an office which belongs in many of its relations to all the states, and to use it as a means of injuring a portion of the states of whom he is thus an agent, is treason to everything that is honorable in man. It is the base and cowardly attack of him who gains the confidence of another in order that he may wound him. But I have often heard it argued, and I have seen it published. I have seen a petition that was circulated for signers announcing that there was an incompatibility between the different sections of the Union, that it had been tried long enough, and that they must get rid of those sections in which the curse of slavery existed. Ah, those sages, so much wiser than our fathers, have found out that there is incompatibility in that which existed when the Union was formed. They have found an incompatibility inconsistent with union in that which existed when South Carolina sent her rice to Boston, and Maryland and Pennsylvania and New York brought in their funds for her relief. The fact is that from that day to this, the difference between the people of the colonies has been steadily diminishing, and the possible advantages of union in no small degree augmented. The variety of product of soil and of climate has been multiplied, both by the expansion of our country and by the introduction of new tropical products not cultivated at that time, so that every motive to union which your fathers had, in a diversity which should give prosperity to the country, exists in a higher degree today than when this union was formed, and this diversity is fundamental to the prosperity of the people of the several sections of the country. It is, however, today, in sentiment and interest, less than on the day when the Declaration of Independence was made. Diversity there is, diversity of character, but it is not of that extreme kind which proves incompatibility, for your Massachusetts man, when he comes into Mississippi, adopts our opinions and our institutions, and frequently becomes the most extreme man among us. As our country has extended, as new products have been introduced into it, this Union and the free trade that belongs to it have been of increasing value. And I say, moreover, that it is not an unfortunate circumstance that this diversity of pursuit and character still remains. Originally, it sprang in no small degree from natural causes. Massachusetts became a manufacturing and commercial state because of her fine harbors, because of her water power, making its last leap into the sea, so that the ship of commerce brought the staple to the manufacturing power. This made you a commercial and a manufacturing people. In the southern states, great plains interposed between the last leaps of the streams and the sea. Those plains were cultivated in staple crops, and the sea brought their products to your streams to be manufactured. This was the first beginning of the differences. Then, your longer and more severe winters, your soil not so favorable for agriculture, in a degree kept you a manufacturing and a commercial people. Even after the cause had passed away, after railroads had been built, after the steam engine had become a motive power for a large part of manufacturing machinery, the natural causes from which your people obtained a manufacturing ascendancy, and ours became chiefly agriculturists, continued to act in a considerable measure to preserve that relation. Your interest is to remain a manufacturing, and ours to remain an agricultural people. Your prosperity, then, is to receive our staple and to manufacture it, and ours is to sell it to you and buy the manufactured goods. This is an interweaving of interests which makes us all the richer and happier. But this accursed agitation, this intermeddling with the affairs of other people, is that alone which will promote a desire in the mind of anyone to separate these great and glorious states. The seeds of dissension may be sown by invidious reflections. Men may be goaded by the constant attempts to infringe upon rights and to disturb tranquillity, and in the resentment which follows it is not possible to tell how far the wave may rush. I therefore plead to you now to arrest a fanaticism which has been evil in the beginning and must be evil in the end. You may not have the numerical power requisite, and those at a distance may not understand how many of you there are desirous to put a stop to the course of this agitation. For me, I have learned since I have been in New England the vast mass of true state rights Democrats to be found within its limits, though not represented in the halls of Congress. And if it comes to the worst, if availing themselves of a majority in the two houses of Congress, they should attempt to trample upon the Constitution, if they should attempt to violate the rights of the states, if they should attempt to infringe upon our equality in the Union, I believe that even in Massachusetts, though it has not had a representative in Congress for many a day, the state rights democracy, in whose breasts beats the spirit of the Revolution, can and will whip the black Republicans. I trust we shall never be thus purified, as it were, by fire, but that the peaceful progressive revolution of the ballot box will answer all the glorious purposes of the Constitution and the Union. And I marked that the distinguished orator and statesman who preceded me in addressing you used the words national and constitutional in such relation to each other as to show that in his mind the one was a synonym of the other. I say so, we become national by the Constitution, the bond for uniting the states, and national and constitutional are convertible terms. Your candidate for the high office of governor, whom I have been once or twice on the point of calling governor, and whom I hope I may be able to soon call so, in his remarks to you has presented the same idea in another form. And well may Massachusetts orators, without even perceiving what they are saying, utter sentiments which lie at the foundation of your colonial as well as your subsequent political history, which existed in Massachusetts before the Revolution, and have existed ever since, whenever the true spirit which comes down from the revolutionary sires has swelled and found utterance within her limits. It has been not only, my friends, in this increasing and mutual dependence of interest that we have found new ties to you. Those bonds are both material and mental. Every improvement or invention, every construction of a railroad has formed a new reason for our being one. Every new achievement, whether it has been in arts or science, in war or in manufactures, has constituted for us a new bond and a new sentiment holding us together. Why, then, I would ask, do we see these lengthened shadows which follow in the course of our political history? Is it because our sun is declining to the horizon? Are they the shadows of evening, or are they, as I hopefully believe, but the mists which are exhaled by the sun as it rises, but which are to be dispersed by its meridian glory? Are they but the little vanishing clouds that flit between the people and the great objects for which the Constitution was established? I hopefully look forward to the reaction which will establish the fact that our sun is still in the ascendant, that cloud which has so long covered our political horizon is to be dispersed, that we are not again to be divided on parallels of latitude and about the domestic institutions of states, a sectional attack on the prosperity and tranquillity of a nation, but only by differences in opinion upon measures of expediency, upon questions of relative interest, by discussions as to the powers of the states and the rights of the states, and the powers of the federal government. Such discussion as is commemorated in this picture of your own great and glorious Webster, when he specially addressed our best, most tried, and greatest man, the pure and incorruptible Calhoun, represented as intently listening to catch the accents of eloquence that fell from his lips. Those giants strove each for his conviction, not against a section, not against each other. They stood to each other in the relation of personal affection and esteem, and never did I see Mr. Webster so agitated, never did I hear his voice falter as when he delivered the eulogy on John C. Calhoun. But allusion was made to my own connection with your great and favorite departed statesman. Of that I will only say, on this occasion, that very early in my Congressional life Mr. Webster was arraigned for an offense which affected him most deeply. He was no accountant, and all knew that. He was arraigned on a pecuniary charge, the misapplication of what is known as the Secret Service Fund, and I was one of the committee that had to investigate the charge. I endeavored to do justice. I endeavored to examine the evidence with a view to ascertain the truth. It is true I remembered that he was an eminent American statesman. It is true that as an American I hoped he would come out without a stain upon his garments. But I entered upon the investigation to find the truth and to do justice. The result was he was acquitted of every charge that was made against him, and it was equally my pride and my pleasure to vindicate him in every form which lay within my power. No one that knew Daniel Webster could have believed that he would ever ask whether a charge was made against a Massachusetts man or a Mississippian. No, it belonged to a lower, to a later, and I trust a shorter-lived race of statesmen, who measure all facts by consideration of latitude and longitude. I honor that sentiment which makes us oftentimes too confident, and to despise too much the danger of that agitation which disturbs the peace of the country. I respect that feeling which regards the Union as too strong to be broken. But at the same time, in sober judgment, it will not do to treat too lightly the danger which has existed and still exists. I have heard our Constitution and Union compared to the granite shores which face the sea, and dashing back the foam of the waves, stand unmoved by their fury. Now I accept the simile, and I have stood upon the shore, and I have seen the waves of the sea dash upon the granite of your own shores which frowns over the ocean, have seen the spray thrown back from the cliffs. But when the tide had ebbed, I saw that the rock was seamed and worn, and when the tide was low, the pieces that had been riven from the granite rock were lying at its base. And thus the waves of sectional agitation are dashing themselves upon the granite patriotism of the land. But even that must show the seams and scars of the conflict. Sectional hostility will follow. The danger lies at your door, and it is time to arrest it. Too long have we allowed this influence to progress. It is time that men should go back to the first foundation of our institutions. They should drink the waters of the fountain at the source of our colonial and early history. You, men of Boston, go to the street where the massacre occurred in 1770. There, you should learn how your fathers strove for community rights. And near the same spot, you should learn how proudly the delegation of democracy came to demand the removal of the troops from Boston, and how the venerable Samuel Adams stood asserting the rights of democracy, dauntless as Hampton, clear and eloquent as Sidney, and how they drove out the myrmidons who had trampled on the rights of the people. All over our country these monuments, instructive to the present generation of what our fathers did, are to be found. In the library of your association for the collection of your early history, I found a letter descriptive of the reading of the church service to his army by General Washington, during one of those winters when the army was ill-clad and without shoes, when he built a little log cabin for a meeting-house, and there, reading the service to them, his sight failed him. He put on his glasses, and with emotion which manifested the reality of his feelings, said, "I have grown gray in serving my country, and now I am growing blind." By the aid of your records you may call before you the day when the delegation of the Army of the Democracy of Boston demanded compliance with its requirements for the removal of the troops. A painfully thrilling case will be found in the heroic conduct of your father's friends, the patriots in Charleston, South Carolina. The prisoners were put upon the hulks where the smallpox existed, and where they were brought on shore to stay the progress of the infection, and were offered, if they would enlist in His Majesty's service, release from all their sufferings, present and prospective, while if they would not, the rations would be taken from their families, and they would be sent back to the hulks and again exposed to the infection. emaciated as they were with the prospect of being returned to confinement, and their families turned out into the streets. The spirit of independence, the devotion to liberty, was so supreme in their breasts that they gave one loud huzzah for General Washington, and went to meet death in their loathsome prison. From these glorious recollections, from the emotions which they create, when the sacrifices of those who gave you the heritage of liberty are read in your early history, the eye is directed to our present condition. Mark the prosperity, the growth, the honorable career of your country under the voluntary union of independent states. I do not envy the heart of that American whose pulse does not beat quicker, and who does not feel within him a high exultation and pride in the past glory and future prospects of his country. With these prospects are associated, if we are only wise, true, and faithful, if we shun sectional dissension, all that man can conceive of the progression of the American people. And the only danger which threatens those high prospects is that miserable spirit which, disregarding the obligations of honor, makes war upon the Constitution, which induces men to assume powers they do not possess, trampling as well upon the great principles which lie at the foundation of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the Union, as upon the honorable obligations which were fixed upon them by their fathers. They, with internecine strife, would sacrifice themselves and their brethren to a spirit which is a disgrace to our common country. With these views, it will not be surprising to those who most differ from me that I feel an ardent desire for the success of this state rights democracy, that convinced as I am of the ill consequences of the described heresies unless they be corrected, of the evils upon which they would precipitate the country unless they are restrained, I say, none be surprised if, prompted by such aspirations, and impressed by such forebodings as now open themselves before me, I have spoken freely, yielding to motives I would suppress and cannot avoid. I have often, elsewhere than in the state of which I am a citizen, spoken in favor of that party which alone is national, in which alone lies the hope of preserving the Constitution and the perpetuation of the government, and of the blessings which it was ordained and established to secure. My friends, my brethren, my countrymen, I thank you for the patient attention you have given me. It is the first time it has ever befallen me to address an audience here. It will probably be the last. Residing in a remote section of the country with private as well as public duties to occupy the whole of my time, it would only be for a very hurried visit, or under some such necessity for a restoration to health as brought me here this season, that I could ever expect to remain long among you, or in any other portion of the Union than the state of which I am a citizen. I have stayed long enough to feel that generous hospitality which evinces itself tonight, which has evinced itself in Boston since I have been here, and showed itself in every town and village of New England where I have gone. I have stayed here, too, long enough to learn that, though not represented in Congress, there is a large mass of as true Democrats as are to be found in any portion of the Union within the limits of New England. Their purposes, their construction of the Constitution, their hopes for the future, their respect for the past, is the same as that which exists among my beloved brethren in Mississippi. In the hour of apprehension I shall turn back to my observations here in this consecrated hall, where men so early devoted themselves to liberty and community independence, and I shall endeavor to impress upon others who know you only as your represented in the two houses of Congress, how true and how many are the hearts that beat for constitutional liberty, and faithfully respect every clause and guarantee which the Constitution contains for any and every portion of the Union. End of Appendix E, Part 2. Recording by Sean Stipsky, Kingman, Arizona.
One of the Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Casper. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Appendix F, Part 1. Appendix F. Speech of Mr. Davis, of Mississippi, in the Senate of the United States, on the resolutions offered by him relative to the relations of the States, the Federal Government, and the Territories, May 7th, 1860. Mr. President: Among the many blessings for which we are indebted to our ancestry is that of transmitting to us a written Constitution, a fixed standard to which in the progress of events every case may be referred, and by which it may be measured. But for this the wise men who formed our government dared not have hoped for its perpetuity, for they saw floating down the tide of time wreck after wreck, marking the short life of every republic which had preceded them. With this, however, to check, to restrain, and to direct their posterity, they might reasonably hope the government they founded should last forever, that it should secure the great purposes for which it was ordained and established, that it would be the shield of their posterity equally in every part of the country, and equally in all time to come. It was this which mainly distinguished the formation of our government from those confederacies or republics which had preceded it, and this is the best foundation for our hope today. The resolutions which have been read, and which I had the honor to present to the Senate, are little more than the announcement of what I hold to be the clearly expressed declarations of the Constitution itself. To that fixed standard it is sought at this time, when we are drifting far from the initial point, and when clouds and darkness hover over us, to bring back the government, and to test our condition today by the rules which our fathers laid down for us in the beginning. The differences which exist between different portions of the country, the rivalries and the jealousies of today, though differing in degree, are exactly of the nature of those which preceded the formation of the Constitution. Our fathers were aware of the different interests of the navigating and planting States, as they were then regarded. They sought to compose those difficulties, and by compensating advantages given by one to the other, to form a government equal and just in its operation, and which, like the gentle showers of heaven, should fall twice blessed, blessing him that gives and him that receives. This beneficial action and reaction between the different interests of the country constituted the bond of union and the motive of its formation. They constitute it today, if we are sufficiently wise to appreciate our interests, and sufficiently faithful to observe our trust. Indeed, with the extension of territory, with the multiplication of interests, with the varieties, increasing from time to time, of the products of this great country, the bonds which bind the Union together should have increased. Rationally considered, they have increased, because the free trade which was established in the beginning has now become more valuable to the people of the United States than their trade with all the rest of the world. I do not propose to argue questions of natural rights and inherent powers. I plant my reliance upon the Constitution, that Constitution which you have all sworn to support, that Constitution which you have solemnly pledged yourself to maintain while you hold the seat you now occupy in the Senate, to which you are bound in its spirit and in its letter, not grudgingly but willingly, to render your obedience and support as long as you hold office under the Federal Government. When the tempter entered the Garden of Eden and induced our common mother to offend against the law which God had given to her through Adam, he was the first teacher of that higher law which sets the will of the individual above the solemn rule which he is bound, as a part of every community, to observe. From the effect of the introduction of that higher law in the Garden of Eden, and the fall consequent upon it, came sin into the world, and from sin came death and banishment and subjugation, as the punishment of sin, the loss of life, unfettered liberty, and perfect happiness followed from that first great law which was given by God to fallen man. Why then shall we talk about natural rights? Who is to define them? Where is the judge who is to sit over the court to try natural rights? What is the era at which you will fix the date by which you will determine the breadth, the length, and the depth of those called the rights of nature? Shall it be after the fall, when the earth was covered with thorns, and man had to earn his bread in the sweat of his brow? Or shall it be when there was equality between the sexes, when he lived in the garden, when all his wants were supplied, and when thorns and thistles were unknown on the face of the earth? Shall it be then? Shall it be after the flood, when, for the first sin committed after the waters retired from the face of the earth, the doom of slavery was fixed upon the mongrel descendants of Ham? If after the flood, and after that decree, how idle is all this prating about natural rights as standing above the obligations of civil government! The Constitution is the law supreme to every American. It is the plighted faith of our fathers. It is the hope of our posterity. I say, then, I come not to argue questions outside of or above the Constitution, but to plead the cause of right, of law and order, under the Constitution, and to plead it to those who have sworn to abide by that obligation. One of the fruitful sources, as I hold it, of the errors which prevail in our country, is the theory that this is a government of one people, that the government of the United States was formed by a mass. The government of the United States is a compact between the sovereign members who formed it, and if there be one feature common to all the colonies planted upon the shores of America, it is desire for community independence. It was for this the Puritan, the Huguenot, the Catholic, the Quaker, the Protestant, left the land of their nativity, and guided by the shadows thrown by the fires of European persecution, they sought and found the American refuge of civil and religious freedom. While they existed as separate and distinct colonies, they were not forbearing towards each other. They oppressed opposite religions. They did not come here with the enlarged idea of no established religion. The Puritans drove out the Quakers. The Church of England men drove out the Catholics. Persecution reigned through the colonies, except perhaps that of the Catholic colony of Maryland, but the rule was persecution. Therefore, I say the common idea, and the only common idea, was community independence, the right of each independent people to do as they pleased in their domestic affairs. The Declaration of Independence was made by the colonies, each for itself. The recognition of their independence was not for the colonies united, but for each of the colonies which had maintained its independence. And so, when the Constitution was formed, the delegates were not elected by the people en masse, but they came from each one of the States. And when the Constitution was formed, it was referred, not to the people en masse, but to the States severally, and severally by them ratified and approved. But if there be anything which enforces this idea more than another, it is the unequal dates at which it received this approval. From first to last, nearly 2 years and a half elapsed, and the government went into operation something like a year, I believe more than a year, before the last ratification was made. Is it then contended that by this ratification and adoption of the Constitution the States surrendered that sovereignty which they had previously gained? Can it be that men who braved the perils of the ocean, the privations of the wilderness, who fought the war of the Revolution, in the hour of their success, when all was sunshine and peace around them, came voluntarily forward to lay down that community independence for which they had suffered so much and so long? Reason forbids it, but if reason did not furnish a sufficient answer, the action of the States themselves forbids it. The great State of New York, great relatively then as she is now, manifested her wisdom in not receiving merely that implication which belongs to the occasion, which was accepted by the other States, but she required the positive assertion of that retention of her sovereignty and power over all her affairs as the condition on which she ratified the Constitution itself. I read from Eliot's Debates. Among her resolutions of ratification is the following: that the powers of government may be reassumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness; that every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States, or the departments of the government thereof, remain to the people of the several States, or to their respective State governments to which they may have granted the same. North Carolina, with the Scotch caution which subsequent events have so well justified, in 1788 passed this resolution: Resolved, that a declaration of rights asserting and securing from encroachments the great principles of civil and religious liberty and the unalienable rights of the people, together with amendments to the most ambiguous and exceptionable parts of said Constitution of Government, ought to be laid before Congress and the Convention of the States that shall or may be called for the purpose of amending the said Constitution, for their consideration previous to the ratification of the Constitution aforesaid on the part of the State of North Carolina. And in keeping with this, North Carolina withheld her ratification. She allowed the government to be formed with the number of States which was required to put it in operation, and still she remained out of the Union, asserting and recognized in the independence which she had maintained against Great Britain, and which she had no idea of surrendering to any other power. And the last State which ratified the Constitution, long after it had in fact gone into effect, Rhode Island, in the third of her resolutions, says: 3. That the powers of government may be reassumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness; that the rights of the States respectively to nominate and appoint all State officers, and every other power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States, or the departments of government thereof, remain to the people of the several States, or their respective State governments to whom they may have granted the same. Here the use of the phrase State governments shows how utterly unwarrantable the construction has been to say that the reference here was to the whole people of the States, to the people of all the States, and not to the people of each of the States severally. I spoke, however, Mr. President, but a moment ago, of the difference of politics, products, population, constituting the great motive for the Union. It was indeed its necessity. Had all the people been alike, had their institutions all been the same, there would have been no interest to bring them together. There would have been no cause or necessity for any restraint being imposed upon them. It was the fact that they differed which rendered it necessary to have some law governing their intercourse. It was the fact that their products were opposite, that their pursuits were various, that rendered it the great interest of the people that they should have free trade existing among each other, that free trade which Franklin characterized as being between the States such as existed between the counties of England. Since that era, however, a fiber then unknown in the United States, and the production of which is dependent upon the domestic institution of African slavery, has come to be cultivated in such amounts, to enter so into the wearing apparel of the world, so greatly to add to the comfort of the poor, that it may be said to day that that little fiber, cotton, wraps the commercial world and binds it to the United States in bonds to keep the peace with us which no government dare break. It has built up the Northern States. It is their great manufacturing interest to day. It supports their shipping abroad. It enables them to purchase in the markets of China, when the high premium to be paid on the milled dollar would otherwise exclude them from that market. These are a part of the blessings resulting from that increase and variety of product, which could not have existed if we had all been alike, which would have been lost to day unless free trade between the United States was still preserved. And here it strikes me as somewhat strange that a book recently issued has received the commendation of a large number of the representatives of the manufacturing and commercial States, though, apart from its falsification of statistics and low abuse of Southern States, institutions, and interests, the great feature which stands prominently out from it is the arraignment of the South for using their surplus money in buying the manufactures of the North. How a manufacturing and commercial people can be truly represented by those who would inculcate such doctrines as these is to me passing strange. Is it vain boasting which renders you anxious to proclaim to the world that we buy our buckets, our rakes, and our shovels from you? No, there is too much good sense in the people for that, and therefore I am left at a loss to understand the motive, unless it be that deep-rooted hate which makes you blind to your own interest when that interest is weighed in the balance with the denunciation and detraction of your brethren of the South. The great principle which lay at the foundation of this fixed standard, the Constitution of the United States, was the equality of rights between the States. This was essential, it was necessary, it was a step which had to be taken first before any progress could be made. It was the essential requisite of the very idea of sovereignty in the state, of a compact voluntarily entered into between sovereigns, and it is that equality of right under the Constitution on which we now insist. But more, when the States united, they transferred their forts, their armament, their ships, and their right to maintain armies and navies to the Federal Government. It was the disarmament of the States under the operation of a league which made the warlike operations, the powers of defense, common to them all. Then, with this equality of the States, with this disarmament of the States, if there had been nothing in the Constitution to express it, I say the protection of every constitutional right would follow as a necessary incident, and could not be denied by any one who could understand and would admit the true theory of such a government. We claim protection, first, because it is our right; secondly, because it is the duty of the general government; and thirdly, because we have entered into a compact together which deprives each State of the power of using all the means which it might employ for its own defense. This is the general theory of the right of protection. What is the exception to it? Is there an exception? If so, who made it? Does the Constitution discriminate between different kinds of property? Did the Constitution attempt to assimilate the institutions of the different States confederated together? Was there a single State in this Union that would have been so unfaithful to the principles which had prompted them in their colonial position, and which had prompted them at a still earlier period to seek and try the temptations of the wilderness? Is there one which would have consented to allow the Federal Government to control or to discriminate between her institutions and those of her Confederate States? But if it be contended that this is argument, and that you need authority, I will draw it from the fountain, from the spring before it had been polluted, from the debates in the formation of the Constitution, from the views of those who, at least it will be admitted, understood what they were doing. Mr. Randolph, it will be recollected, introduced a projet for a government, consisting of a series of resolutions. Among them was one which proposed to give Congress the power to call forth the force of the Union against any member of the Union failing to fulfill its duty under the articles thereof; that was, to give Congress the power to coerce the States, to bring the States into subjection to the Federal Government. Now, sir, let us see how that was treated; and first I will refer to one whose wisdom, as we take a retrospective view, seems to me marvelous. Not conspicuous in debate, at least not among the names which first occur when we think of that bright galaxy of patriots and statesmen, he was the man who above all others, it seems to me, laid his finger upon every danger, and indicated the course which that danger was to take. I refer to Mr. Mason. Mr. Mason observed not only that the present Confederation was deficient in not providing for coercion and punishment against delinquent States, but argued very cogently that punishment could not in the nature of things be executed on the States collectively, and therefore that such a government was necessary as could directly operate on individuals, and would punish those only whose guilt required it. Mr. Madison, who has been called sometimes the father of the Constitution, upon the same question said: "A union of the States containing such an ingredient seemed to provide for its own destruction. The use of force against a State would look more like a declaration of war than an infliction of punishment, and would probably be considered by the party attacked as a dissolution of all previous compacts by which it might be bound. Mr. Hamilton, who, if I were to express a judgment by way of comparison, I would say was the master intellect of the age in which he lived, whose mind seemed to penetrate profoundly every question with which he grappled, and who seldom failed to exhaust the subject which he treated, Mr. Hamilton, in speaking of the various powers necessary to maintain a government, came to clause 4. 4. Force, by which may be understood a coercion of laws, or coercion of arms. Congress have not the former, except in few cases. In particular States this coercion is nearly sufficient, though he held it in most cases not entirely so. A certain portion of military force is absolutely necessary in large communities. Massachusetts is now feeling this necessity and making provision for it. But how can this force be exerted on the States collectively? It is impossible. It amounts to a war between the parties. Foreign powers also will not be idle spectators. They will interpose, the confusion will increase, and a dissolution of the Union will ensue. The consequence was, the proposition was lost. In support of this same idea of community independence, which I have suggested, the argument upon the proposition least likely to have exhibited it, that to give power to restrain the slave trade shows the Northern and Southern men all arguing and presenting different views, yet concurred in this, that there could be no power to restrain a State from importing what she pleased. As the Senator from Vermont, Mr. Collamer, looks somewhat surprised at my statement, I will refer to the authority. Mr. Rutledge said: "Religion and humanity had nothing to do with this question. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations. The true question at present is whether the Southern States shall or shall not be parties to the Union. If the Northern States consult their interest, they will not oppose the increase of slaves, which will increase the commodities of which they will become the carriers." Mr. Pinckney: "South Carolina can never receive the plan if it prohibits the slave trade. In every proposed extension of the powers of Congress, that State has expressly and watchfully excepted that of meddling with the importation of negroes. If the States be all left at liberty on this subject, South Carolina may perhaps by degrees do of herself what is wished, as Virginia and Maryland already have done." Mr. Sherman was for leaving the clause as it stands. He disapproved of the slave trade, yet as the States were now possessed of the right to import slaves, as the public good did not require it to be taken from them, and as it was expedient to have as few objections as possible to the proposed scheme of government, he thought it best to leave the matter as we find it. Mr. Baldwin had conceived national objects alone to be before the convention, not such as, like the present, were of a local nature. Georgia was decided on this point. That State has always hitherto supposed a general government to be the pursuit of the central States, who wished to have a vortex for everything; that her distance would preclude her from equal advantage, and that she could not prudently purchase it by yielding national powers. From this it might be understood in what light she would view an attempt to abridge one of her favorite prerogatives. If left to herself, she may probably put a stop to the evil. As one ground for this conjecture, he took notice of the sect of , which he said was a respectable class of people who carried their ethics beyond the mere equality of men, extending their humanity to the claims of the whole animal creation. Mr. Gerry thought we had nothing to do with the conduct of the States as to slaves, but ought to be careful not to give any sanction to it. Mr. King thought the subject should be considered in a political light only. If two States will not agree to the Constitution, as stated on one side, he could affirm with equal belief on the other that great and equal opposition would be experienced from the other States. He remarked on the exemption of slaves from duty, while every other import was subjected to it, as an inequality that could not fail to strike the commercial sagacity of the Northern and Middle States. Here, as will be observed, everywhere was recognized and admitted the doctrine of community independence and state equality, no interference with the institutions of a state, no interference even prospectively, save and except with their consent. And thus it followed that at one time it was proposed to except from the power to prohibit the further introduction of Africans those states which insisted upon retaining the power. And finally it was agreed that a date should be fixed beyond which probably none of them desired to retain it. These were states acting in their sovereign capacity, they possessed power to do as they pleased, and that was the view which they took of it. I ask then, how are we, their descendants, those holding under their authority, to assume a power which they refused to admit upon principles eternal and lying at the foundation of the Constitution itself? If then there be no such distinction or discrimination, if protection be the duty, and who will deny it, with which this government is charged, and for which the states pay taxes, because of which they surrendered their armies and their navies, if general protection be the general duty, I ask in the name of reason and constitutional right, I ask you to point me to authority by which a discrimination is made between slave property and any other. Yet this is the question now fraught with evil to our country. It is this which has raised the hurricane threatening to sweep our political institutions before it. This is the dark spot which some already begin to fear may blot out the constellation of the Union from the political firmament of mankind. Does it not become us then calmly to consider it, justly to weigh it, to hold it in balances from which the dust has been blown, in order that we may see where truth, right, and the obligations of the Constitution require us to go? It may be pardoned to one who from his earliest youth up has been connected with a particular party, who has always believed that the welfare and the safety of the country most securely rested with that party, who has seen in the triumph of democracy the triumph of the Union, and who has believed for years past that the downfall of democracy would be its destruction. It may be pardoned, I say, under such circumstances as these, to such a person as that, to refer even in this connection to that feature of the particular point which I am discussing, which has been brought forward by the recent action of that party. States met together to consult as brethren, to see whether they could agree as well upon the candidate as upon the creed, and it was apparent that division had entered into our ranks. After days of discussion, we saw that party convention broken. We saw the enemies of democracy waiting to be invited to its funeral, and jestingly looking into the blank faces of those of us to whom the telegraph brought the sad intelligence. I hope this is, however, but the mist of the morning. I have faith in the democracy, and that it still lives. I have faith in the patriotism and in the good sense of the democracy, that they will assert the truth, boldly pronounce it, meet the issue, and I trust in the good sense and patriotism of the people for their success. In this connection it may be permissible to review our present party condition. For a long time two parties divided the people of the United States. The controversy was mainly upon questions of expediency, sometimes of constitutionality. They divided men in all of the states. The contest was sometimes won by one and sometimes by the other. The Whig party lives now but in history, yet it has a history of which any of its members may be proud. It bore the high but not successful part of stemming the tide of popular impulse, and thus failed to attain the highest power. Differing from them upon the points at issue, I offer the homage of my respect to those who, adhering to what they believe to be true, go down sooner than find success in the abandonment of principle. With the disappearance of that party, and perhaps for the very reasons that caused its disappearance, uprose radical organizations who strode so far beyond progressive democracy that democracy took the place now left vacant by the old Whig party, and became the reservoir into which all conservatism was poured. Therefore it is that so many of those men, eminent in their day, eminent for their services, eminent in their history, have approved of the Democratic party in the present condition of the country as the only conservative element which remains in our politics. In the midst of this radicalism, of this revolutionary tendency, it becomes not the regret of a partisan merely, it is the sadness of an American citizen, that the party on which the conservative hopes of the country hang has been threatened with division, and possibly may not hereafter be united. Thanks to a sanguine temperament, thanks to an abiding faith, thanks to a confidence in the Providence which has so long ruled for good the destiny of my country, I believe it will reunite, and reunite upon sound and acceptable principles. At least I hope so. From the postulates which I have laid down result the fourth and fifth resolutions. They are the two which I expect to be opposed. They contain the assertion of the equality of rights of all the people of the United States in the Territories, and they declare the obligation of the Congress to see these rights protected. I admit that the United States may acquire eminent domain. I admit that the United States may have sovereignty over territory. Otherwise the sovereign jurisdiction which we obtained by conquest or treaty would not pass to us. I deny that their agent, the Federal Government, under the existing Constitution, can have eminent domain. I deny that it can have sovereignty. I consider it as the mere agent of the States, an agent of limited power, and that it can do nothing save that which the Constitution empowers it to perform, and that, though the treaty or the deed of cession may direct or control, it cannot enlarge or expand the powers of the Congress; that it is not sovereign in any essential particular. It has functions to perform, and those functions I propose now to consider. The power of Congress over the Territories, a subject not well defined in the Constitution of the United States, has been drawn from various sources by different advocates of that power. One has found it in the grant of power to dispose of the territory and other public property; that is to say, because the agent was authorized to sell a particular thing, or to dispose of it by grant or barter, therefore he has sovereign power over that and all else which the principal, constituting him as an agent, may hereafter acquire. The property, besides the land, consisted of forts, of ships, of armaments, and other things which had belonged to the States in their separate capacity, and were turned over to the Government of the Confederation, and transferred to the Government of the United States, and of this, together with the land so transferred, the Federal Government had the power to dispose, and of territory thereafter acquired, of arms thereafter made or purchased, of forts thereafter constructed, or custom houses, or docks, or lights, or buoys; of all these, of course, it had power to dispose. It had the power to create them. It must of necessity have had the power to dispose of them. It was only necessary to confer the power to dispose of those things which the Federal Government did not create, of those things which came to it from the States, and over which they might signify their will for its control. I look upon it as the mere power to dispose of, for considerations and objects defined in the trust, the land held in the United States, none of which then was within the limits of the States, and the other public property which the United States received from the States after the formation of the Union. I do not agree with those who say the government has no power to establish a temporary and civil government within a territory. I stand halfway between the extremes of squatter sovereignty and of Congressional sovereignty. I hold that the Congress has the power to establish a civil government, that it derives it from the grants of the Constitution, not the one which is referred to, and I hold that power is limited and restrained first by the Constitution itself, and then by every rule of popular liberty and sound discretion, to the narrowest limits which the necessities of the case require. The Congress has power to defend the territory, to repel invasion, to suppress insurrection. The Congress has power to see the laws executed. For this it may have a civil magistracy, territorial courts. It has the power to establish a federal judiciary. To that federal judiciary, from these local courts, may come up to be decided questions with regard to the laws of the United States and the Constitution of the United States. These combined give power to establish a temporary government, sufficient perhaps for the simple wants of the inhabitants of a territory, until they shall acquire the population, until they shall have the resources and the interests which justify them in becoming a state. I am sustained in this view of the case by an opinion of the Supreme Court of the United States in 1845, in the case of Pollard's Lessee versus P. Hagan, 3 Howard 222, 223, in which the court say: "Taking the legislative acts of the United States and the States of Virginia and Georgia, and their deeds of cession to the United States, and giving to each separately and to all jointly a fair interpretation, we must come to the conclusion that it was the intention of the parties to invest the United States with the eminent domain of the country ceded, both national and municipal, for the purposes of temporary government, and to hold it in trust for the performance of the stipulations and conditions expressed in the deeds of cession and the legislative acts connected with them." This was a question of land. It was land lying between high and low water, over which the United States claimed to have and to exercise authority, because of the terms on which Alabama had been admitted into the Union. In that connection the court say in the same case: "When Alabama was admitted into the Union on an equal footing with the original States, she succeeded to all the rights of sovereignty, jurisdiction, and eminent domain which Georgia possessed at the date of the cession, except so far as this right was diminished by the public lands remaining in the possession and under the control of the United States, for the temporary purpose provided for in the deeds of cession and the legislative acts connected with it. Nothing remained in the United States according to the terms of the agreement but the public lands, and if an express stipulation had been inserted in the agreement granting the municipal right of sovereignty and eminent domain to the United States, such stipulation would have been void and inoperative, because the United States has no constitutional capacity to exercise municipal jurisdiction, sovereignty, or eminent domain within the limits of a State, or elsewhere except in cases in which it is expressly granted." Another case arose not long afterward, in which not land but religion was involved, where suit was brought against the municipality of New Orleans because they would not allow a dead body to be exposed at a place where, according to the religious rites of those interested, it was deemed they had a right thus to expose it. On that the Supreme Court say, speaking of the ordinance for the government of Louisiana: "So far as they conferred political rights and secured civil and religious liberties, which are political rights, the laws of Congress were all suspended by the State Constitution, nor is any part of them in force unless they were adopted by the Constitution of Louisiana as laws of the State." Thus we find the Supreme Court sustaining the proposition that the Federal Government has power to establish a temporary civil government within the limits of a territory, but that it can enact no law which will endure beyond the temporary purposes for which such government was established. In other cases the decisions of the court run in the same line, and in 1855 the then Attorney General, most learned in his profession, and in what else is he not learned, for he may be said to be a man of universal acquirements, Attorney General Cushing then foretold what must have been the decision of the Supreme Court on the Missouri Compromise, anticipating the decision subsequently made in the case of Dred Scott, that decision for which the venerable justices have been so often and so violently arraigned. He foretold it as the necessary consequence from the line of precedents descending from 1842, affirmed and reaffirmed in different cases, and now bearing on a case similar in principle, and only different in the mere reference to the subject involved from those which had gone before. As connected with the decision which had agitated the peace of the country, as the anticipation of that decision before it was made, viewing it as the necessary consequence of the decisions which the court had made before. If it be the pleasure of the Senate, I ask my friend from South Carolina, Mr. Chestnut, to read for me a letter of the Attorney General, being an official answer made by him in relation to the military reservation which was involved in the question before him. End of Appendix F, Part 1. Recording by Maria Casper.
F of the Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1A. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government by Jefferson Davis, Volume 1A, Appendix F, Part 2. Mr. Chestnut read from the Opinions of the Attorneys General, Volume 7, page 575. The Supreme Court has determined that the United States never held any municipal sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of soil in the territory of which any of the new states have been formed, except for temporary purposes, and to execute the trusts created by the deeds of cession. By the force of the same principle, and in the same line of adjudications, the Supreme Court would have had to decide that the provision of the Act of March 6, 1820, which undertakes to determine in advance the municipal law of all that portion of the original province of Louisiana which lies north of the parallel 3630 north latitude, was null and void ab incepto, if it had not been repealed by a recent act of Congress. For an act of Congress which pretends of right, and without consent or compact, to impose on the municipal powers of any new state or states limitations and restrictions not imposed on all, is contrary to the fundamental condition of the Confederation, according to which there is to be equality of right between the old and new states, in all respects whatsoever. Mr. Davis. It was not long after this official opinion of the Attorneys General before the case arose on which the decision had been made which has so agitated the country. Fortunate, indeed, was it for the public peace that land and religion had been decided. Those questions on which men might reason had been the foundation of judicial decision, before that which drives all reason, it seems, from the mind of man, came to be presented the question whether Cuffy should be kept in his normal condition or not, the question whether the Congress of the United States could decide what might or might not be property in the territory. The case being that an officer of the army sent into a territory to perform his public duty, having taken with him his negro slave. The court, however, in giving their decision in this case, or their opinion, if it suits the gentleman better, have gone into the question with such clearness, such precision, and such amplitude, that it will relieve me from the necessity of arguing it any further than to make a reference to some sentences contained in that opinion. And here, let me say, I cannot see how those who agreed on a former occasion that the constitutional right of the slaveholder to take his property into the territory, the constitutional power of the Congress, and the constitutional power of the territory to legislate upon that subject should be a judicial question, can now attempt to escape the operation of an opinion which covers the exact political question which, it was known beforehand, the court would be called upon to decide. Decided in strictness of technical language, it was known it could not be. Hundreds, thousands, a vast variety of cases may arise, and centuries elapse, and leave that court, if our Union still exists, deciding questions in relation to the character of property in the territories. But the great and fundamental idea was that, after 30 years of angry controversy, dividing the people and paralyzing the arm of the federal government, some umpire should be sought which would compose the difficulty and set it upon a footing to leave us in future to proceed in peace. And that umpire was selected which the Constitution had provided to decide questions of law. I asked my friend to read some extracts from the decision. Mr. Chestnut read as follows from the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, pages 55 through 57. The territory being a part of the United States, the government and the citizen both enter it under the authority of the Constitution, with their respective rights defined and marked out, and the federal government can exercise no power over his person or property beyond what that instrument confers, nor lawfully deny any right which it has reserved. The powers over person and property of which we speak are not only not granted to Congress, but are in express terms denied, and they are forbidden to exercise them. And this prohibition is not confined to the states, but the words are general and extend to the whole territory over which the Constitution gives it power to legislate, including those portions of it remaining under territorial government, as well as that covered by states. It is a total absence of power everywhere within the domain of the United States, and places the citizens of a territory, so far as these rights are concerned, on the same footing with citizens of the states, and guards them as firmly and plainly against any inroads which the general government might attempt under the plea of implied or incidental powers. And if Congress itself cannot do this, if it is beyond the powers conferred on the federal government, it will be admitted, we presume, that it could not authorize a territorial government to exercise them. It could confer no power on any local government established by its authority to violate the provisions of the Constitution. And if the Constitution recognizes the right of property of the master and the slave, and makes no distinction between the description of property and other property owned by a citizen, no tribunal acting under the authority of the United States, whether it be legislative, executive, or judicial, has a right to draw such a distinction, or deny to it the benefit of the provisions and guarantees which have been provided for the protection of private property against the encroachments of the government. This is done in plain words, too plain to be misunderstood, and no word can be found in the Constitution which gives Congress a greater power over slave property, or which entitles property of that kind to less protection than property of any other description. The only power conferred is the power coupled with the duty of guarding and protecting the owner in his rights. Upon these considerations, it is the opinion of the Court that the act of Congress which prohibited a citizen from holding and owning property of this kind in the territory of the United States north of the line therein mentioned is not warranted by the Constitution, and is therefore void, and that neither Dred Scott himself nor any of his family were made free by being carried into this territory, even if they had been carried there by the owner, with the intention of becoming a permanent resident. Mr. Davis: Here then, Mr. President, I say, the umpire selected as the referee in the controversy has decided that neither the Congress nor its agent, the territorial government, has the power to invade or impair the right of property within the limits of the territory. I will not inquire whether it be technically a decision or not. It was obligatory on those who selected the umpire and agreed to abide by the award. It is well known to those who have been associated with me in the two houses of Congress that, from the commencement of the question, I have been the determined opponent of what is called squatter sovereignty. I never gave it countenance, and I am now least of all disposed to give it quarter. In 1848 it made its appearance for good purposes. It was ushered in by a great and good man. He brought it forward because of the distrust which he had in the capacity of the government to bear the rude shock to which it was exposed. His apprehension, no doubt, in some extent sharpened and directed his patriotism, and his reflection led him to a conclusion to which, I doubt not, today he adheres as tenaciously as ever, but from which it was my fortune, good or ill, to dissent when his letter was read to me in manuscript. I being, together with some other persons, asked, though not by the writer, whether or not it should be sent. At the first blush I believed it to be fallacy, a fallacy fraught with mischief. that it escaped an issue which was upon us, which it was our duty to meet, that it escaped it by a side path, which led to a greater danger. I thought it a fallacy which would surely be exploded. I doubted then, and still more for some time afterward, when held to a dread responsibility for the position which I occupied. I doubted whether I should live to see the fallacy exploded. It has been more speedily, and, to the country, more injuriously than I anticipated. In the meantime, what has been its operation? Let Kansas speak, the first great field on which the trial was made. What was then the consequence? The Federal Government withdrawing control, leaving the contending sections excited to the highest point upon the question, each to send forth its army. Kansas became the battlefield, and Kansas the cry, which well nigh led to civil war. This was the first fruit, more deadly than the fatal upas. Its effect was not limited to the mere spot of ground on which the dew fell from its leaves, but it spread throughout the United States. It kindled all which had been collected for years of inflammable material. It was owing to the strength of our government and the good sense of the quiet masses of the people that it did not wrap our country in one widespread conflagration. What right had Congress then, or has it now, to shrink from the performance of a duty because the mere counters spread on the table may be swept off, when they have not answered the purposes for which they were placed? What is it to you or me or anyone when we weigh our own continuation in place against the great interests of which we are conservators, against the welfare of the country and the liberty of our posterity to the remotest ages? What is it, I say, which can be counted in the balance on our side against the performance of that duty which is imposed upon us? If anyone believes Congress has not the constitutional power, he acts conscientiously in insisting upon Congress not usurping it. If anyone believes that the squatters upon the lands of the United States within a territory are invested with sovereignty, having won it by some of those processes unknown to history, without grant or without revolution, without money and without price, he, adhering to the theory, may pursue it to its conclusion. To the first class, those who claim sovereign power over the territories for Congress, I say, lay your hand upon the Constitution, and find there the warrant of your authority. Of the second, those whom I have last spoken, I ask, in the Constitution, reason, right, or justice, what is there to sustain your theory? The phraseology which has been employed on this question seems to me to betray a strange confusion of ideas. To speak of a sovereignty, a plenary legislative power deriving its power from an agent, a sovereignty held subject to articles with the formation of which that sovereignty has nothing to do, a compact to which it was not a party. You say to a sovereign, A and B have agreed to certain terms between themselves, and you must govern your conduct according to them. Yet I do not deny your sovereignty, that is, the power to do as they please, provided it conforms to the rule which others chose to lay down. Can this be a definition of sovereignty? But again, sir, nothing seems to me more illogical than the argument that this power is acquired by a grant from the Congress, connected with the other argument that Congress have not got the power to do the act themselves, that is to say, that the recipient takes more than the giver possessed, that a territorial legislator can do anything which a state legislature can do, and that, subject to the Constitution, means merely the restraints imposed upon both. This is confounding the whole theory and the history of our government. The states were the grantors. They made the compact. They gave the federal agent its powers. They inhibited themselves from doing certain things, and all else they retained to themselves. This federal agent got just so much as the states chose to give, no more. It could do nothing, save by warrant of the authority of the grant made by the states. Therefore its powers are not comparable to the powers of the state legislature, because one is a creature of grant, and the other the exponent of sovereign power. The Supreme Court have covered the whole ground of the relation of the Congress to the territorial legislatures, the agent of the states and the agent of the Congress, and the restrictions put upon one are those put upon the other. in language so clear as to render it needless further to labor the subject. In 1850, following the promulgation of this notion of squatters' sovereignty, we had the idea of non-intervention introduced into the Senate of the United States, and it is strange to me how that idea was expanded. It seems to have been more malleable than gold, to have been hammered out to an extent that covers boundless regions uncovered by those who proclaimed the doctrine. Non-intervention then meant, as the debates show, that Congress should neither prohibit nor establish slavery in the territories. That I hold to now. Will anyone suppose that Congress has meant by non-intervention that Congress should legislate in no regard in respect to property in slaves? Why, sir, the very acts which they passed at the time refute it. There is the Fugitive Slave Law, and that abomination of laws which assumed to confiscate the property of a citizen who should attempt to bring it into this district with intent to remove it to sell it at some other time and at some other place. Congress acted then upon the subject, acted beyond the limit of its authority, as I confidently believed, and if ever that art comes before the Supreme Court, I feel satisfied they will declare it null and void. Are we to understand that those men thus acting at the very moment intending by non-intervention to deny and repudiate the laws they were then creating? The men who stood most prominently the advocate of the measures of that year, who, great in many periods of our history, perhaps shone then with the brightest light his genius ever emitted, I refer to Henry Clay, has given his own view on this subject, and I suppose he may be considered as the highest authority. In June 18, 1850, I had introduced an amendment to the Compromise Bill, providing, and that all laws, or parts of laws, usages, or customs pre-existing in the territories acquired by the United States from Mexico, and which in said territories restrict, abridge, or obstruct the full enjoyment of any right of person or property of a citizen of the United States, as recognized or guaranteed by the Constitution or laws of the United States, are hereby declared and shall be held as repealed. Upon that Mr. Clay said, Mr. President, I thought that upon this subject there had been a clear understanding in the Senate that the Senate would not decide itself upon the lex loci as it respects slavery, that the Senate would not allow the territorial legislature to pass any law, in other words, that it would leave the operation of the local law or of the Constitution of the United States upon that local law, to be decided by the proper and competent tribunal, the Supreme Court of the United States. Appendix to the Congressional Globe, 31st Congress, 1st Session, page 916. That was the position taken by Mr. Clay, the leader. A mere sentence will show with what view I regarded the dogma of non-intervention when that amendment was offered. I said, but what is non-intervention seems to vary as often as the light and shade of every fleeting cloud. It has different meanings in every state, in every county, in every town. If non-intervention means that we shall not have protection for our property in slaves, then I always was, and always shall be, opposed to it. If it means that we shall not have the protection of the law because it would favor slaveholders, that Congress shall not legislate so as to secure to us the benefits of the Constitution, then I am opposed to non-intervention, and shall always be opposed to it. Appendix to the Congressional Globe, 31st Congress, 1st Session, page 919. Mr. Downs, one of the Committee of 13, and an advocate of the measures, said, what I understand by non-intervention is an interposition of Congress prohibiting or establishing or interfering with slavery. Appendix to Congressional Globe, 31st Congress, 1st Session, page 99. By what species of legerdemain this doctrine of non-intervention has come to be extended to a paralysis of the government on the whole subject, to exclude the Congress from any kind of legislation whatever, I am at a loss to conceive. Certain it is not the theory of that period, and it was not contended for in all the controversies we had then. I had no faith in it then. I considered it to be an evasion. I held that the duty of Congress ought to be performed, that the issue was before us and ought to be met. The sooner the better. That truth would prevail if presented to the people, borne down today. It would rise up tomorrow. And I stood then on the same general plea which I am making now. The senator from Illinois, Mr. Douglas, and myself differed at the time, as I presume we do now. We differed radically then. He opposed every proposition which I made, voting against propositions to give power to the territorial legislature to protect slave property which should be taken there, to remove the obstructions of the Mexican laws, voting for a position to exclude the conclusion that slavery might be taken there, voting for the proposition expressly to prohibit its introduction, voting for the proposition to keep in force the laws of Mexico which prohibited it. Some of these votes, it is but just to him, I should say, I think he gave purpose to his instructions, but others of them, I think it is equally fair to suppose, were outside of the limits of any instructions which could have been given before the fact. In 1854, advancing in this same general line of thought, the Congress, in enacting territorial bills, left out a provision which had before been usually contained in them, requiring the legislature of the territory to submit its laws to the Congress of the United States. It has been sometimes assumed that this was the recognition of the power of the territorial legislature to exercise plenary legislation, as might that of a state. It will be remembered that, when our present form of government was instituted, there were those who believed the federal government should have the power of revision over the laws of a state. It was long and ably contended for in the convention which formed the Constitution, and one of the compromises which was made was an appellate power, to lodge power in the Supreme Court to decide all questions of constitutional law. But did this omission of the obligation to send here the laws of the territories work this grant of power to the territorial legislature? Certainly not. It could not, and that it did not is evinced by the fact that at a subsequent period the organic act was revised because the legislature of the territory of Kansas was offensive to the Congress of the United States. Congress could not abdicate its authority. It could not abandon its trust, and, when it omitted the requirement that the laws should be sent back, it created a casus which required it to act without the official records being laid before it, as they would have been if the obligation had existed. That was all the difference. It was not enforcing upon the agent the obligation to send the information. It left Congress, as to its power, just where it was. I find myself physically unable to go as fully into the subject as I intended, and therefore, omitting a reference to those acts, suffice it to say that here was the recognition of the obligation of Congress to interpose against a territorial legislature for the protection of personal right. That is what we ask of Congress now. I am not disposed to ask this Congress to go into speculative legislation. I am not one of those who would willingly see this Congress enact a code to be applied to all territories and for all time to come. I only ask that cases as they arise may be met according to the exigency. I ask that when personal and property rights of the territories are not protected, then the Congress, by existing laws and governmental machinery, shall intervene and provide such means which will secure in each case, as far as may be, an adequate remedy. I ask no slave code, nor horse code, nor machine code. I ask that the territorial legislature be made to understand beforehand that the Congress of the United States does not concede to them the power to interfere with the rights of person or property guaranteed by the Constitution, and that it will apply the remedy if the territorial legislature should so far forget its duty, so far transcend its power, as to commit the violation of right. That is the announcement of the fifth resolution. These are the general views which I entertain of our right of protection and the duty of the government. They are those which are entertained by the constituency I have the honor to represent, whose delegation has recently announced those principles at Charleston. I honor them, and I approve their conduct. I think their bearing was worthy of the mother state which sent them there, and I doubt not she will receive them with joy and gratitude. They have asserted and vindicated her equality of right. By that asserted equality of right I doubt not she will stand, for weal or for woe, for prosperity or adversity, for the preservation of the great blessings which we enjoy, or the trial of a new and separate condition. I trust Mississippi never will surrender the smallest atom of the sovereignty, independence, and equality to which she was born, to avoid any danger or any sacrifice to which she may hereby be exposed. The sixth resolution of the series declares at what time a state may form a constitution and decide upon her domestic institutions. I deny this right to the territorial condition, because the territory belongs in common to the states. Every citizen of the United States, as a joint owner of that territory, has the right to go into it with any property which he may possess. These territorial inhabitants require municipal law, police, and government. They should have them, but they should be restricted to their own necessities. They have no right within their municipal power to attempt to decide the rights of the people of the states. They have no right to exclude any citizen of the United States from owning and equally enjoying this common possession. It is for the purpose of preserving order and giving protection to the rights of person and property that a municipal territorial government should be instituted. The last resolution refers to a law founded on a provision of the Constitution, which contains an obligation of faith to every state of the Union, and that obligation of faith has been violated by 13 states of the Confederacy, as many as originally fought the battles of the Revolution and established the Confederation. Is it to be expected that a compact thus broken in part, violated in its important features, will be regarded as binding in all else? Is the free trade which the North sought in the formation of the Union, and for which the states generally agreed to give Congress the power to regulate commerce, to be trampled under foot by laws of obstruction, not giving to the citizens of the South that free transit across the territory of the Northern states which we might claim from any friendly state under Christendom? And is Congress to stand powerless by on the doctrine of non-intervention? We have a right to claim abstinence from interference with our rights from any government on the earth. Shall we claim no more than that which we have constituted for our own purposes, and which we support by draining our own means for its support? We have had agitation, changing its form and gathering intensity, for the last 40 years. It was first for political power, and directed against new states. Now it has assumed a social form, is all-prevailing, and has reached the point of revolution and civil war. For it was only last fall that an overt act was committed by men who were sustained by arms and money, raised by extensive combination among the non-slaveholding states, to carry treasonable war against the state of Virginia, because now, as before the Revolution, and ever since, she held the African in bondage. This is part of the history and marks the necessity of the times. It warns us to stop and reflect, to go back to the original standard, to measure our acts by the obligation of our fathers, by the pledges they made one to another, to see whether we are conforming to our plighted faith, and to ask seriously, solemnly, looking each other inquiringly in the face, what we should do to save our country. This agitation, being at first one of sectional pride for political power, has at last degenerated or grown up to, as you please, a trade. There are men who habitually set aside a portion of money which they are annually to apply to what are called charitable purposes, that is to say, so far as I understand it, to support some vagrant lecturer, whose purpose is agitation and mischief wherever he goes. This constitutes, therefore, a trade, a class of people who are thus employed for mischief, for incendiary purposes, perhaps not always understood by those who furnish the money, but such is the effect, such is the result of their action. And in this state of the case, I call upon the Senate to affirm the great principles on which our institutions rest. In no spirit of crimination have I stated the reasons why I present it. For these reasons I call upon them now to restrain the growth of evil passion, and to bring back the public sense as far as in them lies, by earnest and united effort, if it may be, to crown our country with peace, and start it once more in its primal channel on a career of progressive prosperity and justice. The majority section cannot be struggling for additional power in order to preserve their rights. If any of them ever believed in what is called Southern aggression, they know now they have the majority in the representative districts and in the electoral college. They cannot, therefore, fear an invasion of their rights. They need no additional political power to protect them from that. The argument then, or the reason on which this agitation commenced, has passed away, and yet we are asked, if a party hostile to our institutions shall gain possession of the government, that we shall stand quietly by and wait for an overt act. Overt act? Is not a declaration of war an overt act? What would be thought of a country that, after a declaration of war, while the enemy fleets are upon the sea, should wait until a city has been sacked before it should say that war existed, or resistance should be made? The power of resistance consists, in no small degree, in meeting the evil at the outer gate. I can speak for myself, and I have no right to speak for others when I say that, if I belonged to a party organized on the basis of making war on any section or interest in the United States, if I know myself, I would instantly quit it. We have made no war against you. We have asked no discrimination in our favor. We claim to have but the Constitution fairly and equally administered. To consent to less than this would be to sink in the scale of manhood, would be to make our posterity so degraded that they could curse this generation for robbing them of the rights their revolutionary fathers bequeathed them. Among the great purposes declared in the preamble of the Constitution is one to provide for the general welfare. Provision for the general welfare implies general fraternity. This union was not expected to be held together by coercion. The power of force as a means was denied. They sought, however, to bind it perpetually together with that which was stronger than triple bars of brass and steel, the ceaseless current of kind offices, renewing and renewed in an eternal flow, and gathering volume and velocity as it rolled. It was a function intended not for the injury of any. It declared its purpose to be the benefit of all. Concessions which were made between the different states in the convention prove the motive. Each gave to the other that which was necessary to it, what each could afford to spare. Young as a nation, our triumphs under this system have had no parallel in human history. We have tamed a wilderness, we have spanned a continent, we have built up a granary that secures the commercial world against the fear of famine. Higher than all this, we have achieved a moral triumph. We have received, by hundreds of thousands, a constant tide of immigrants, energetic, if not well educated, fleeing, some from want, some from oppression, some from the penalties of violated law, receive them into our society, and by the gentle suasion of a government which exhibits no force, by removing want and giving employment, they have subsided into peaceful citizens, and have increased the wealth and power of our country. If, then, this temple so blessed, and to the roof of all which we were about to look to see it extended over the continent, giving a protecting arm to infant republics that need it, if this temple is tottering on its pillars, what, I ask, can be a higher or nobler duty for the Senate to perform than to rush to its pillars and uphold them, or to be crushed in the attempt? We have tampered with a question which has grown in magnitude by each year's delay. It requires to be plainly met. The truth is to be told. The patriotism and the sound sense of the people, whenever the federal government from its high places of authority shall proclaim the truth, in unequivocal language, will, in my firm belief, receive and approve it. But so long as we deal, like the Delphic oracle, in words of double meaning, so long as we attempt to escape from responsibility, and exhibit our fear to declare the truth by the fact that we do not act upon it, we must expect speculative theory to occupy the mind of the public, and error to increase as time rolls on. But if the sad fate should be ours for this minute cause to destroy our government, the historian who shall attempt philosophically to examine the question will, after he has put on his microscopic glasses and discovered it, be compelled to cry out, "Veritably so the unseen insect in the course of time destroys the mighty oak. Now I believe, may I not say I believe? If not, then I hope there is yet time, by the full explicit declaration of the truth, to disabuse the popular mind, to arouse the popular heart, to expose the danger from lurking treason and ill-concealed hostility, to rally a virtuous people to their country's rescue, who, circling closer and deeper as the storm gathers fury around the ark of their fathers' covenant, will place it in security, there happily to remain a sign of fraternity, justice, and equality to our remotest posterity." End of Appendix F. End of The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume A, by Jefferson Davis.